On that cold night, the wind blew with a painful persistence, dragging the thin mist between the tall, twisted trees. The moonlight, diffused behind thick clouds, cast elongated shadows on the ground covered with dead leaves. They were shadows that seemed to pulse, alive, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. The branches creaked as if protesting against the darkness that enveloped them, and the rustling of the leaves, sometimes soft, sometimes abrupt, could easily be mistaken for stealthy footsteps. Amid this scene, almost invisible in the penumbra, there was the figure of a man carrying a child in his arms. The child was Brian, a blind boy of only 5 years old, whose face reflected innocence but also a restless curiosity about the world he could not see. He did not see the twisted trees, but he felt the cold, damp air of the forest on his skin. His sense of smell, more acute due to his lack of vision, picked up the scent of wet earth, sap oozing from old trunks, and moss spreading across damp stones. The man carrying him was named Richard, the boy's stepfather. However, at that moment, there was not a trace of affection or protection in Richard, nothing one would expect from a guardian. His expression was loaded with a cold, almost cruel determination. He walked quickly, stumbling over roots from time to time. Not once did he caress the boy or explain what he was doing. Each time Brian desperately called, "Daddy," Richard responded with a silence heavier than any speech. After agonizing minutes, Richard went deeper into the darkness, completely veering off any known trail. He stopped abruptly, looked around as if searching for a reference point, and then, without uttering a single word, put Brian on the ground covered with dry leaves. Brian immediately pressed his little fingers against the soil, trying to recognize the texture of the place, maybe even identify something familiar, some kind of sign that might calm him. "Daddy, what's happening?" His small voice was gentle, fearful, seeking some comfort that never came. Instead of answering, Richard turned his back and walked away, vanishing among the shadows. His footsteps grew increasingly inaudible until absolute silence prevailed. Alone and confused, Brian felt his heart pound. He felt the ground around him, trying to understand what was happening, trying to find any remnant of hope. The loneliness that befell Brian was not just the absence of people, but a premonition of a hostile world he barely understood. Without sight, he needed to rely on what he could hear, touch, and smell. The forest, however, reverberated with unfamiliar sounds. A crack here, leaves tearing in the distance, the hoot of an owl hidden in the treetops. For a 5-year-old child, that dark vastness was overwhelming. He felt the ground again. He sensed the moisture and cold penetrating his fingers. The rustling of the leaves revived the fear that someone, or something, might be lurking nearby. With nowhere to go, Brian decided to stand up carefully and try to listen. His breathing was unsteady, and he struggled to remain calm. Fear, however, would not be defeated so easily. Knowing that he had been abandoned by his stepfather, Brian began calling for his mother, Emily, in the vain hope she would appear like a saving angel. His small voice echoed unanswered through the forest. The wind sounded like a sinister laugh, making it clear that there, in that vastness of trunks and shrubs, no safe shelter existed for a vulnerable child. Then Brian took his first step, feeling his feet sink into the layer of leaves. The only thing he could do was walk, because standing still meant succumbing to despair. The forest was a maze of sounds. With each step, Brian moved blindly forward, guided by touch and instinct, bumping into bushes, stumbling over roots, hurting his knees and hands. Even so, he kept going, for the fear of the unknown was great, but the will to survive was even greater. Suddenly, he stopped. He had a clear sense that something was watching him, perhaps an animal, or something worse. The boy's heart raced. The snap of a branch, too close to be coincidence, made him turn instinctively. He saw nothing, but he heard strong breathing, more powerful and guttural than that of a human being. The smell that permeated the air was wild, vaguely resembling leather, earth, and sweat mixed together. It was unlike anything he had ever known. For an instant, panic paralyzed him. Then something lightly touched Brian's fingers. A soft yet bumpy texture with coarse hairs, thick fur. It was not a human hand, nor the paw of a dog or other domestic animal. Slowly, the boy felt the contour of that huge hand and realized that it belonged to a being of titanic strength. The creature let out a deep, yet not aggressive growl. It was more curious than threatening. The boy, though still trembling, began to understand he was facing something extraordinary. The mysterious creature was Titan, a massive mountain gorilla. His eyes, if seen clearly, would reflect the moonlight intensely, revealing deep curiosity. He was strong, with muscular arms and a broad chest, and even without standing fully upright, he towered over Brian. Yet there was an unusual gentleness in this giant's approach to the boy. Without hesitation, Titan gathered Brian into his arms. For the child, it was a shock, because the gorilla was enormous, and feeling those big hands lifting him without violence was almost unbelievable. At first, Brian drew back, fearing an attack, but no attack came. Instead, Titan just raised him gently, examining the small human in his arms. Sensing no resistance, Titan let out a low, comforting sound. As the minutes passed, Brian began to realize he was not in danger. There was a palpable sense of protection in the gorilla's movements. Gradually, his panic subsided, giving way to a strange serenity. Brian, though unable to see Titan, sensed that this being was his refuge in the darkness. There was no logic to the situation, a wild gorilla adopting a blind and lost boy, but amidst the hostile vastness of that forest, that was exactly what was happening. Still carrying Brian, Titan moved through the forest with impressive precision. The dense vegetation was no obstacle for the gorilla, who pushed through shrubs and thick roots. The boy, though frightened, felt the powerful movement of Titan's muscles. The smell of leaves and earth filled Brian's nostrils, and he was learning to perceive his surroundings in a sensory way. Step by step, Titan guided him to a safer place. After a few minutes, they arrived at a clearing bathed in the moon's diffused light. The space was wide, enclosed by large trees forming a kind of natural circle. In the center, several stones formed a semicircle where other gorillas rested. There were females, some with babies clinging to their fur, and younger males who observed Titan with respect. Seeing the dominant male arrive with a small human in his arms, they stirred, growling softly and approaching cautiously to investigate. One of the females, with a gentle gaze, came closer to Brian and began to sniff him. Hesitant, she touched his face with her fingertips, as though trying to understand who, or what, was before her. Brian trembled slightly but did not pull away. He sensed the touch was gentle and filled with curiosity. The gorilla's characteristic odor was stronger now, and every sound, every chest beating, and every grunt seemed to serve a communicative purpose. Without Brian knowing it, that was Luna, one of the group's most protective females. Noting the child's vulnerability, she showed no hostility. On the contrary, she welcomed the boy, as though he were a lost baby. She pulled him closer and ran her hairy hand across his back, a gesture that, for her species, signaled care. Titan, seeing this behavior, placed Brian on the ground beside Luna. From that moment on, the boy was no longer alone. He had been temporarily accepted by this strange family. Meanwhile, far away, Brian's mother, Emily, was hospitalized in a nearby city's hospital. She had suffered a nervous breakdown after successive episodes of domestic violence. Richard, the stepfather, was not just cold or negligent. He was violent, manipulative, and cruel. Emily had been hospitalized to recover from both physical and psychological injuries. She could barely sleep because of her enormous worry about her son. However, when asked about Brian's whereabouts, Richard coldly stated that the boy had run away. The hospital staff, lacking proof to the contrary, could not challenge him directly, but the head nurse, who had known Emily for a long time, was suspicious of Richard. This nurse, Marta, contacted local authorities, expressing her concern. "The boy is blind and very young. It's impossible he ran off on his own without leaving any trace." That fact alone set off a red flag throughout the city's security system. The case reached James, a veteran investigator who had seen it all in his career. As soon as he read the report about Brian's supposed disappearance, he sensed something about Richard's story was off. A 5-year-old blind boy simply vanishing without anyone noticing? Improbable. especially considering Richard's behavior in recent months. James decided to open a preliminary investigation and send a team to search the area around Richard and Emily's house. The leading theory was that Brian had been abandoned or kidnapped. Given his experience, James suspected abandonment because there was no sign of a ransom or motive for an abduction. So the police began combing the nearby forest, employing sniffer dogs and powerful flashlights to penetrate the dense darkness lurking in that region. In the forest, the morning light gradually dispelled the darkness. The sunbeams pierced the fog and cast golden rays onto the clearing. Brian woke up curled into Luna's fur, which had kept him warm during the cold night. As he stood, he smelled the morning dew and the slight rise in temperature. He was hungry, but had no idea where to find food. Noticing his agitation, Luna came over and held out a piece of fruit she had found. It tasted bittersweet, with juice running through his fingers. Although hesitant, Brian accepted the food, first exploring it by touch and then by smell, before cautiously taking a bite. His taste buds relished the fresh flavor, offering him slight relief. Luna emitted a soft, almost maternal sound and went back to observing him as he ate. Titan, meanwhile, remained nearby, watching over the group, safeguarding everyone. He was the leader, and one of his tasks was to ensure no predator approached. Now calmer, Brian tried to understand better what was happening around him. He heard the tapping of gorilla fingers on the ground, the scraping of leaves as they searched for insects or fed on vegetation, and the range of grunts that served as their own form of communication. Unable to see, the boy tuned in even more keenly to the sounds, smells, and the instincts guiding him. His hearing, already naturally more attentive, now became his main ally. In turn, each member of the group grew accustomed to the little human's presence. Some young gorillas even approached curiously, tugging gently on Brian's soft hair, as if questioning what this little creature was doing among them. Although he did not speak their language, Brian responded with small smiles and gentle gestures that, in a way, seemed to be understood. The region the group inhabited was blessed with lush nature, but was also fraught with risks. Among the usual predators was a leopard that prowled the hunting grounds. Adult gorillas in a group pose a formidable defense, but young ones or vulnerable individuals could be easy targets. And Brian, so fragile, might draw even more attention from the feline. Stealthy and cunning, the leopard rarely revealed itself by day, preferring to hunt in the early hours of morning or at dusk. Its graceful, lethal movements and spotted coat provided perfect camouflage among low vegetation and tall foliage. Any mistake could be fatal. One afternoon, when the sun began to set in an orange glow, Titan detected a strange smell in the air. His leader's instinct was immediately triggered. Standing up, he pounded his chest with clenched fists and emitted a deep roar that echoed through the forest. The other gorillas paused, going on alert. Brian, even without sight, sensed the fear in that call. Something dangerous was near. The leopard crept closer, drawn by Brian's scent, different from what it was used to. Watching from a distance, the feline sized up its apparently defenseless human prey, trying to find an angle of attack that would not leave it vulnerable to the adult gorilla's counterattack. But Titan would not stand down. What was clear to Brian was that the huge gorilla would not abandon him. The boy heard the low growl of the leopard drawing closer. His heart pounded, and the fear returned. But before the predator could lunge, Titan charged with a thunderous roar. The ground seemed to quake at the force of his steps, and the air vibrated with the power of his guttural cry. The leopard sprang forward to attack, but Titan intervened. In a split second, there was a dull thud, and the predator backed off, wounded, and letting out a furious yowl. Other gorillas joined the defense, their cries and chest-beating resounding like thunder among the trees. With no chance against a tight-knit, enraged group, the leopard chose to slip away into the darkening forest. Brian, frozen in place until then, felt Titan's enormous hand touch his shoulder, as though to say, "You're safe now." The boy exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. The danger had passed, but the memory would stay forever. Without Titan, his fate would have been tragic. Back in the city, James intensified the search. He had questioned Richard repeatedly, who kept repeating the same false story. I was lying down, and Brian disappeared. He just opened the door and ran out. I never saw him again." But to James, with all his experience, that story was riddled with holes. First, how could a 5-year-old blind child escape without banging into trees or tripping on rocks in the yard? Second, why was Richard so indifferent? The search team ventured deep into the forest with sniffer dogs. It was not long before they found some clues, small child's footprints alongside adult male footprints, indicating Brian had not been alone when entering the woods. That discovery was enough for James to summon Richard again. Under pressure, the stepfather tried to deflect. "Maybe I went after him but couldn't find him. He must have run farther." With each excuse, his story unraveled more. Meanwhile, Emily was showing some improvement at the hospital. Upon hearing that her son was missing, she panicked and had to be sedated again when her blood pressure soared to dangerous levels. Nurse Marta tried to comfort her, assuring her that the police were doing everything possible. Emily, racked with worry, could barely speak. She just wanted to hug her son and save him from this uncertain fate. While the investigation proceeded, Brian lived a completely different routine. The gorillas guided him around the clearing, teaching him, albeit in a rudimentary way, to move about without seeing. He learned to interpret the different grunts and sound variations, understanding when it was time to eat, rest, or follow them to a specific part of the group's territory. Whenever Titan left to patrol the perimeter, Luna took over Brian's care. Her maternal instincts led her to offer him fruits, roots, and even edible leaves. Brian, having little choice, adjusted to the forest's flavors. Often he made faces at the bitter taste or strong smells, but Luna insisted, and little by little he learned the value of each wild food. Water came from a stream not far from the clearing. The gorilla group usually went there in the mornings and late afternoons. At first, Brian was terrified of crossing uneven ground, stepping over hidden roots, tripping on stones, but Titan and Luna were there to help. Gently, they would offer him an arm for support, or guide him by the shoulder, helping him find the way. Thus, Brian's other senses developed further, tuning in to the strength of the water's current, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the aromas of flowers and moss around him. However, the forest's climate was not always welcoming. On stormy nights, when the wind tore through the treetops and thunder rumbled in the distance, the gorillas would gather in more sheltered spots. Brian was frightened by the thunderclaps, but Titan's steady presence lessened his fear. The gorilla stood guard at the front of the group, on alert for any unexpected event. During a lightning flash, Brian cried out, covering his ears, but one of the younger females embraced him by the shoulders, a gentle touch that soothed him. More and more, he understood that this strange family in the jungle would not abandon him. As the days passed, James's team found more tracks pointing to Brian's presence. The dogs discovered footprints in a denser part of the forest, confirming that the boy had been there. Alongside these prints was something unusual, massive footprints likely belonging to a gorilla. Such creatures were rare in forests near human-inhabited areas. They might have migrated or been introduced for some unknown reason, but the evidence was incontrovertible. "Boss," said one of the field agents, showing James a plaster cast of a gigantic footprint, "this definitely isn't human, looks like a large primate, and it's fresh." James frowned, perplexed. He knew of environmental reserves in the region, but had no records of free-roaming gorillas there. Regardless, this finding could not be dismissed. If a gorilla was involved, how did that affect Brian's survival odds? There were cases of gorillas being aggressive when threatened, but also reports of surprisingly protective behavior under the right conditions. It was a mystery. News of these footprints made headlines in local papers. The public began to wonder whether the blind boy had been carried off by a gorilla or devoured by a predator. Concern grew, and the fragile image of Brian became more deeply etched into the collective imagination. Mothers prayed for him, children asked at home whether the lost boy would be saved, and authorities stepped up their pressure on Richard. At the hospital, Emily received ongoing psychological and medical support. Each time the door opened, she hoped to see Brian come in, smiling, accompanied by a police officer or someone who might have rescued him. But these images existed only in her mind. Reality was harsh. Her son remained missing, and his chances of being found alive diminished as the days passed. Emily felt overwhelming guilt for allowing Richard into their lives. She met him when Brian was still a baby. He seemed kind and willing to care for the child. But as soon as he became the boy's stepfather, his true nature emerged. A merciless man who never accepted Brian's special condition. Over time, Emily suffered verbal and physical abuse, but remained silent for fear of losing custody of her son and out of fear of Richard's violence. "It's all my fault," she repeated to Marta, the nurse. "I should have run away sooner. I should have protected my son." Marta tried to console her, assuring her that the police had intensified the search and that James was a very capable investigator. But the words fell into a well of anguish. Emily fought to remain conscious, despite her deep sadness. She begged God to save her little Brian. Meanwhile, Richard began to feel the pressure of the investigation and growing rumors. He realized the noose was tightening. People gave him suspicious looks on the street. Neighbors whispered, pointing him out as a monster capable of abandoning a blind boy in the forest. At home, he felt he'd soon be arrested. He slept poorly, lived in agitation, and even tried packing his bags to flee. One late afternoon, he spotted a police car patrolling his block. That was enough for him to dash to the garage and start the car, planning to escape. However, before he could leave, another police car blocked the street. 2 officers got out and signaled him to step away from the vehicle. In that moment, Richard knew his time had come. He was handcuffed in front of neighbors peeking through their windows. James's firm voice read him his rights. The charges included abandonment of a vulnerable person and attempted murder, as evidence suggested he had led Brian into the woods and abandoned him there. Richard remained silent, though inwardly he was panicking. His arrest meant the end of his freedom and an implicit confession of his atrocity. With Richard in custody, the police obtained clearer information. Under additional questioning, he finally admitted to leaving Brian at a specific spot in the forest. James then mobilized a helicopter to fly over the area, equipped with thermal cameras to detect any sign of life. The operation was delicate because the forest canopy was thick, making visibility difficult. In the helicopter, 2 agents monitored screens for heat signatures that might correspond to the boy. They picked up large areas of heat, presumably large animals, possibly the gorilla whose footprint had been found. The group was in a clearing a few miles from the main road. Near this group was a smaller heat signature, presumably human. It could be Brian. The agents' hearts raced as they confirmed the location and prepared to land. At the same time, Emily, who had just been released from the hospital, insisted on accompanying the rescue team. Although still weak, her maternal resolve was unbreakable. She put on appropriate hiking clothes and joined the police until they reached a safe point for their trek into the woods. Hearing the helicopter hovering above, Emily's heart pounded. Could they finally find Brian? The ground team stayed in radio contact with the helicopter following the heat signals. After a grueling hike through rough terrain, they approached the clearing. In a coordinated formation, they moved carefully, knowing that if guerrillas were present, any rash action could spark a confrontation. Time seemed suspended when the team entered the clearing and glimpsed, in the distance, a startling sight. A group of guerrillas forming a semicircle around a central point. And there was Brian, sitting and playing with a small stick, surrounded by the giant creatures who somehow protected him. Noticing the armed men drawing closer, Titan stood tall, beating his chest and roaring loudly, warning them not to come too near. Breathless, Emily spotted that fragile child. Despite the distance, she knew it was her son. She was overwhelmed by emotion. Without thinking twice, she broke through the police line and ran toward him, calling his name. The guerrillas grew restless, prepared to defend Brian from this apparent intruder. Titan raised his arms, confused. But Brian, hearing his mother's voice, struggled to his feet and ran, however he could, in her direction. His mother's shout was unmistakable. Seeing the boy's desperate run, Titan lowered his arms, as though understanding there was no threat in that embrace. Emily dropped to her knees, enveloping Brian in her arms, crying with relief. The force of maternal love filled the clearing, making the air itself feel lighter. The officers behind her watched, a lump in their throats. Once Emily had her arms around Brian, Titan approached slowly. Some agents raised their weapons, but James ordered them not to fire unless absolutely necessary. The gorilla observed the scene with curiosity and caution. Brian, sensing his friend was near, reached out and touched Titan's fur. To everyone's astonishment, Titan leaned down to the boy, issuing a low, almost purring sound, and touched his enormous hand to Brian's forehead. It was a moment of communion, two beings from vastly different worlds, united by a mutual need for care and protection. Emily, still on her knees, watched in disbelief. Tears ran down her cheeks as she witnessed the enormous primate express something akin to affection for her blind son. Brian smiled, even without seeing, for he felt the gentle vibration in Titan's touch. Their hearts seemed to beat in unison. Finally, Titan withdrew, as if saying, "Now you're safe with your mother." Luna and the other gorillas, sensing that Brian had reunited with his human family, stepped back too. That brief farewell broke many internal barriers. Emily understood that Titan had been her son's guardian angel in that green hell. No words could convey her gratitude. After a few moments, the police had to intervene and gently drive the gorillas away to escort Brian and Emily to safety outside the clearing. An ambulance was waiting by the roadside, ready to take Brian and Emily to the hospital for examination. The boy was visibly undernourished, with scratches and small wounds, but his overall health was surprisingly stable. The medical staff were amazed he had survived so long in such a dangerous forest. Asked how he managed, Brian could not explain in detail, but kept repeating, "They fed me, they protected me. Titan and Luna were with me." News spread rapidly. Newspapers, TV programs, and social networks reported on the miracle of a blind 5-year-old child surviving alone in the woods, cared for by a group of gorillas. People were moved by the story and outraged by Richard's actions. Child welfare organizations demanded exemplary punishment. Animal protection NGOs also praised the nobility of the gorillas, emphasizing that when undisturbed, the species can show remarkable compassion. With the evidence from the investigation, footprints, Richard's testimony, and the discovery of the boy in the forest, his guilt was beyond doubt. The trial was followed by a crowd of outraged citizens gathered outside the courthouse with signs calling for justice. At the defendant's table, Richard tried to justify himself, but his words rang hollow. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution laid out how close Brian had come to death. The charge of attempted murder rested on the fact that Richard had intentionally abandoned a blind child in a hostile environment, aware that survival was highly unlikely. The defense claimed Richard was disturbed and had not planned to kill the boy, but the jury was unconvinced. During the trial, Emily was called to testify. She wept as she recounted the abuse she had endured, how Richard despised Brian because of his blindness. Those present felt a surge of sympathy for her, as well as profound indignation. The verdict was delivered. Richard was sentenced to 30 years in prison. A murmur of approval swept through the courtroom. Emily, though in tears, felt immense relief knowing that man would never threaten her or approach Brian again. After the trial, Emily and Brian's life took a new turn. Public outcry brought opportunities their way. Many individuals and organizations stepped up to help. A non-profit for visually impaired children offered special therapy, sensory support, and even training for a guide dog. Brian now had access to resources he had never had before. Additionally, the media coverage prompted donations and sponsorships for special equipment for the boy. Despite everything, Brian remained a sweet child with a keen curiosity about the world. He told everyone, in his childlike voice, how huge and gentle Titan had been, how Luna smelled of the forest, and how the baby gorillas played around him. His accounts lacked complex details but conveyed a tenderness that moved all who listened. Emily, now free from Richard's control, devoted herself to her son. Over time, she regained her health and returned to work. She managed to rent a small house in a quiet neighborhood where Brian had a bedroom adapted to his needs, filled with sensory toys and braille materials. Despite all they had endured, mother and son felt stronger and more united than ever. A few months went by. Brian's curiosity about his forest friends remained. Emily, understanding the importance of that bond, decided to take her son back there, accompanied by a team of biologists and forest rangers. The goal was to investigate the presence of gorillas in the area, map their territory, and, if possible, chart their migration routes to protect them. On a sunny Saturday, mother and son ventured into the woods. The towering trees, once so threatening, now gave off a sense of adventure. Brian walked hand in hand with Emily, using a modified cane to guide him over rugged terrain. A local biologist named Francisco led the way, alert to any sign of the gorillas. After a long walk, they reached an area near the clearing where Brian had spent his days with the group. Then came a familiar sound, a forceful chest beating followed by a deep grunt. Titan was there, watching them from among the trees, with Luna and other members of the group by his side. Though Brian could not see, he recognized that call. His face lit up with a broad smile, and he gently released Emily's hand, stepping carefully toward the sound. Titan took a few steps forward as well, tasting the air, likely recognizing Brian's scent. He let out a soft growl, and Luna also approached. Emily's heart pounded as she witnessed her son's reunion with the great gorilla. There was no fear this time, only genuine joy between two creatures who had once saved each other in dire circumstances. Titan extended his hand, and Brian touched it, laughing softly as though greeting an old friend. The team of biologists watched, awestruck. It was rare to see something so profound and moving. Carefully, no one moved too close. They kept a respectful distance, understanding this was a privileged moment. Emily silently thanked Titan for showing up, as though to say, "Thank you for saving my son." Brian's case became emblematic, symbolizing both human cruelty and nature's capacity for empathy and compassion. Many began reflecting on how gorillas, often feared and misunderstood, could show protective and altruistic behavior. Experts in animal behavior explained that in some cases, great primates perceive human children as vulnerable offspring and may care for them. Schools and universities discussed the topic, debating the human-nature relationship, ethical treatment of animals, and the importance of conserving ecosystems. An image of Brian embracing Titan became something of an icon on social media, a reminder that goodness can appear in the most unexpected places, and that innocence is precious beyond measure. Meanwhile, Richard's sentence served as a warning about domestic violence and child abuse. Many women, inspired by Emily's courage in speaking out, found the strength to seek help and break their own cycles of abuse. Thus, Brian's story was not an isolated tragedy. It became a catalyst for social awareness. Over time, Brian's physical and emotional scars were replaced by the spirit of a cheerful boy, brimming with curiosity about the world. At home, he played with his guide dog, a brown Labrador named Toby, and explored every new object by touch. He attended a specialized school, learned Braille, and did occupational therapy. Despite his blindness, his forest ordeal had made him stronger and more confident. He proudly shared stories of the gorillas, delighting classmates and teachers with his account of survival. As for Titan and his troop, the biologists who had visited continued to observe and protect that forest reserve, ensuring the gorillas had a safe habitat. Occasionally, the team spotted the group from a distance, noting that they seemed well adapted to their territory. Though they did not have regular contact with humans, the memory of the blind boy who had lived among them remained a deeply moving experience for everyone who had witnessed that improbable friendship. Thus, Brian's story spread worldwide, featured in documentaries, scientific articles, TV programs, and even children's books that highlighted his bravery and Titan's kindness. Its legacy was an invitation to ponder the blurred lines between the human and the wild, to foster empathy, and to cherish the beauty of nature that, when respected, can show acts of love beyond what most people imagine possible. Ultimately, Brian's story shows that even in the darkest places, there can be light, and even in the most inhospitable environments, kindness can blossom. He became a symbol of resilience, inspiring people to believe life can indeed surprise us with acts of gentleness and solidarity. Abandonment and blindness would be enough of a challenge for any child, yet Brian found a protector in the imposing figure of Titan. This unlikely encounter elevated the story to a sort of modern fable in which nature sympathizes with human pain. And when all seemed lost, the miracle of a bond between different species proved that there are ties stronger than mere instinct. Ties born of empathy and the urge to protect life, regardless of shape or origin.